So for the record, I'm in the Eastern time zone at the University of Virginia, and I'm going to talk about tundra dynamics and tundra greening and browning. And I caught a glimpse of Scott's introductory slides, and I'm wondering if about doing a definition, if I'm going to give you a good enough definition of greening and browning, because I wasn't necessarily thinking about that, but I do think it's important. I would just say that from the perspective of this talk, greening is essentially increases in vegetation, in some aspect of the vegetation, abundance or cover or productivity, and browning does not mean the death of vegetation. Okay, browning just means that there are decreases in some aspect of the vegetation, be that abundance or cover or productivity. And I also want to point out that this talk is not necessarily comprehensive. Okay, so I'm going to give examples of things that we've seen in the literature, and it's not extensive. So keep that in mind. You know, if you've done research on this and it doesn't show up, but the intent was not to try to capture everything. And then also, I'm going to be talking about not just the satellite observations, but things that have been done on the ground with regard to greening and browning of tundra vegetation. So this is maybe something that you've seen, or you've seen something similar to this. The general tendency of Arctic tundra over at least the AVHRR, the NOAA satellite record since 1982, is one of greening. The Arctic report card is something that I've been working on for a few years. It's an annual report card that NOAA puts out. We use two metrics of the NDVI in that. We use the peak NDVI, with NDVI, the normalized difference vegetation index, which is an index of the greenness of vegetation. We use the maximum NDVI, the peak of the growing season, and then we use basically a growing season integrated value of NDVI. That's the TI NDVI, and they show us some couple of different things. But the point here is that the general tendency of the tundra is one of greening. We've broken it into Eurasia and North America, and then the average northern hemisphere as a whole. And you see, in general, we're seeing greening in all of those realms. But if you take a look more carefully spatially, you'll see that the entire tundra isn't greening. Okay, we have some areas that, based on these indices of max and integrated NDVI, some areas of tundra are greening very strongly, particularly the north slope of Alaska and northeastern Eurasia have strong greening signals. But there are also browning signals or areas that are browning, and the YK Delta in Alaska, the high Arctic of Canada, and areas in northwestern Siberia have also shown browning or decreases in the NDVI over the course of that satellite record since 1982. If we look at the integrated index, we see that the browning signal is a little bit stronger than the peak, than the max NDVI. And we also note, this is from Uma Bhatt's work, 2017 paper, we also note that the browning signal seems to be greater in the latter part of the record. We cut the record here at 1998, and the early part of the record showed more greening. The latter part of the record has much more browning sort of infused in that signal. This is a new paper that I won't get you bogged down in the details, but this is a new paper that just came out in Geophysical Research Letters, Richley et al. Basically, it cuts the greening signal up by the different tundra subzones, and the idea here is that the greening signal, the greening relative to increases in temperature, and the index of temperature in this paper is the summer warmth index. The sum of the monthly mean temperature is greater than 0, and so this is showing that the greening signal relative to the warming signal is highest in the south than it is in the north. And an easy way to visualize this is if you look at subzone A, which is the north, you see the summer warmth index in red going up rather dramatically, and the NDVI not doing a heck of a lot. And these are relative changes, okay? So it's not that there's not a lot of vegetation in subzone A. These are relative changes. So we see latitudinal patterns. So what are the controls of these dynamics of tundra vegetation? A first cut at what would be an important control is summer temperatures, and similar to the summer warmth index that Richley used in that study. Richley et al. Used in that study, and there are studies that look at the effects of summer temperature on NDVI at the top. Vickers et al. 2017, increases in mean summer temperatures, and those are strongly related to the increases in max NDVI. On the left, you see the average temperature, the trend in the summer temperatures in the sort of magenta, and then the trend in the NDVI, the max NDVI in the green. So there's a correlation there between summer temperatures and max NDVI. Another study, Van der Waal and Steen, 2014. These are studies from Svalbard, and the July temperature is strongly related to the summer, to the plant biomass that occurs during that summer. So summer warmth, summer temperatures are an important variable, but that breaks down sometimes, and not all summer temperatures don't always correlate with changes in vegetation. Oh, I wanted that in front. So what this does, it looks at the correlation between summer warmth index and the maximum NDVI cut by subzone and by continent, and we see that the NDVI is actually most responsive to interannual variability in summer warmth in the middle subzones of the tundra. So subzones B and C and D, I meant for that box down there at subzone E to sit on top of that figure. But if you look at subzone E, which is where we're seeing the greatest amount of greening, there is no significant relationship between summer warmth and the peak NDVI. So summer warmth and maybe other indices of summer temperatures don't always explain whether you've got a productive summer or not from a tundra perspective. So one component of greening is shrub expansion. And it's not the only component of greening, okay? We can see greening without shrub expansion. It's not necessary to have shrub expansion in order to see greening. We can see greening of other components of the vegetation. So maybe you remember this. Okay, this was sort of the scientific community's first cut, probably, at looking at shrub expansion, the Sturm et al. Nature paper, and this is likely in the south where you find more shrubs and taller shrubs. In the south, shrub expansion is a likely culprit for greening. The Sturm et al. Paper focused on riparian areas in northern Alaska, but work that followed this indicated that shrub expansion is not just a riparian phenomenon, it's an upland phenomenon as well. This is a paper from one of my graduate students, J.J. Frost, 2014 in Global Change Biology, and he looked at remote sensing, repeat high-resolution remote sensing imagery from spy satellite imagery and high-resolution commercial satellites, and showed that shrub expansion was occurring throughout Siberia, throughout northern Siberia and the tundra, largely associated with alder, a tall deciduous shrub, sometimes nitrogen-fixing species, and that it wasn't just occurring in riparian areas, in active and inactive floodplains, or even lowlands. If you look at the left, those are all upland sites, and all of those sites showed a pretty substantial degree of shrub expansion. So shrub expansion is a phenomenon that appears to be occurring across landscape types, and likely explains a lot of the greening, at least in the southern subzones. And there have been some good synthesis studies on shrub expansion. Marten et al. Published this paper in 2017. This is a conceptual diagram of the ultimate and the proximal controls on what might drive the growth of shrubs and the expansion of shrubs across the landscape. I'm not going to focus on the conceptual figure, but just show you some of the results. So it's really what this study was. It was a meta-analysis. I want to make sure I'm not going too long. It's a meta-analysis that identified the different controls on shrub growth. And on the left, so the circles represent our pie charts of what the different explanatory variables were. And on the left, they identified air temperature and soil moisture as the dominant controls on shrub growth in this meta-analysis. And then on the right is when they removed those two variables. So they looked at tertiary and more and further variables. So when those variables were removed from the analysis, herbivory and active layer depth were the most explanatory variables. So it's a nice meta-analysis, and it gets at some of the controls of shrub growth, potential controls on shrub expansion, and maybe some of the geographic patterns of shrub expansion. A new paper by Isla Myers, Smith, and David Hick, 2018. They also did a synthesis. It's actually, the synthesis is part of a more extensive paper that does some other things. But the synthesis part of the paper examined 60 studies where they looked at shrub changes. Most of these were in the high northern latitudes. And several of these studies documented increases in recruitment of shrubs. A few of them looked at advances in the shrub line, so actually showing the shrub line moving in a direction, maybe in a northerly direction, but that was not a focus of most of these studies. Only a few of the studies looked at advances in the shrub line. So we've got some good circumpolar synthetic pieces of work for shrub expansion. So now let's go on to browning, and this is the title there: Arctic browning, extreme events and trends, reversing Arctic greening. There's a paper in Global Change Biology. Actually, it was a commentary in Global Change Biology by Gareth Phoenix and Jarle Bjerke, and they gave numerous examples on browning and what some of the causes of browning might be. Some of those are intuitive, some of those are not necessarily so intuitive. Herbivory could lead to browning, insect outbreaks, fungal pathogens. Extreme winter warming is one that might be counterintuitive. If you get an extreme winter warming event, and you melt the protective insulative layer of the snow cover, if you have a frost or freezing event following that, then you can get frost drought, and you can get vegetation death. So reduced snow cover can also lead to that effect, and spring freezing and what I mentioned, frost drought could be harmful for vegetation. But on the flip side, if you have delayed snow melt and you have deeper snowpacks, which I think we're seeing in some of the places in the tundra, if you have deeper snowpacks and that snowpack stays around for longer, you reduce the length of your growing season, and that could also lead to browning. Fire and disturbances, other disturbances like I mentioned in the list above, could also lead to browning. It might be short-term browning, but it might be nevertheless browning that shows up in the signal. And the graph there shows just an example of how it's an annual value of NDVI change against an annual value of summer warmth change, and you see all those things in the boxes in the bottom where NDVI goes down from one year to the next, and you even have several years. There are like 2, 4, 6, 7 instances where the summer warmth went up and the NDVI went down. So interesting potential implications for browning. Jarle Bjerke looked at this at the site scale. in Arctic Norway and on Svalbard, and then also look to see whether or not that damage can be captured by the NDVI. And the bottom line was that yes, if you have a certain degree of damage, you can actually the degree of damage would be indicated by the NDVI, as you can see in the graphs over there to the right. All right, so that's my kind of a short review. I want to give you my opinions on where we are with regard to progress. I think tundra shrub expansion, which is one component of greening, but again, it is not greening in its entirety. I think we're generally making good progress. Myers-Smith et al. Published synthesis papers, and I showed you the Marten et al. And the Myers-Smith and Hick paper. But I think we still have some work to do with regard to what are the environmental factors and mechanisms that drive shrub expansion and lead to heterogeneity in shrub expansion in different parts of the Arctic. With regard to general tundra greening and browning, I think we have progress at specific sites, regions, and circumpolar. And there are some papers that are examples of site level, regional level, circumpolar level work. But I think we're still lacking a really good synthesis of tundra greening and browning to answer the following questions. What controls the interannual variability in tundra vegetation? I still don't think we have a good handle on what makes a productive year and what makes a less productive year in tundra. And then how does this generate the trends in greening and browning that we're seeing? How do these dynamics manifest spatially and temporally throughout the circumpolar Arctic, given that we know the conditions are really heterogeneous? And I think there's a need to synthesize across a variety of techniques, synthesize across field studies, observation networks, regional and circumpolar remote sensing, and simulation modeling. So now I'm hoping we have at least a few minutes for discussion, if Sarah and Erik think we do.
I think you ran out the clock on your time.
Dang, man. Shoot. All right.
Let's see. Let's leave questions till the end.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you. All right. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Scott, you can go ahead and share your screen now.
Okay. Can you all see that?
We can, and you can go to presentation mode. Yep.
Okay. So picking up where Howie left off, I'll be focusing primarily in the boreal, part of the Arctic Boreal domain. And this is a nice image I stole from Brendan Rodgers in one of the ABoVE working group updates on where we are with this. So basically what I want to do is just try to give a really brief overview, as Howie did in the Arctic, for the boreal, what we currently know, maybe a little bit about what greening and browning is and why it matters, what's been done in recent years mostly, and a bit about the drivers, as Howie also hit on, some of the unresolved issues, and then how we're currently addressing them, and what some of the next steps might be. So this is a slide that I stole from Ted Hogg. Glad both of you guys are on the line. So basically, in terms of what we mean by greening and browning, I think Howie captured it. You know, it's trends in productivity through time. Positive trends are greening. The opposite is browning. But there's a lot of different ways we can go about getting at that, whether it's from satellites and these spectral vegetation indices, or a whole suite of different field measurements, or other ways that we capture net primary productivity. And then from more of a forestry perspective, there's the traditional inventory approaches and increments of biomass. And then there's a whole number of drivers which are in the scale, some of the things that can drive productivity one direction or another, whether increasing due to changes in the growing season length or soil temperature, nutrient cycling, nitrogen deposition, CO2 fertilization. And then in the opposite direction, things like drought and fire, maybe flooding, extreme weather events, insects, and other types of disturbance. So that's a quick overview of that. And my slide is not moving. Huh. Bummer. It seems to be hung. Let me try to.
If you can't,
Scott, you want to stop sharing and then try resharing or something?
I can also share it, Scott, and you can just tell me to advance slides.
Asking me to kill the app. If you can share it, that would be great, Sarah. Sorry about this. I seem to be stuck, actually.
Is that right where you want to be?
Okay, yeah, that's actually, if you go back one, just real quick, and then advance the animation. Okay, so just in terms of why it matters, real quick, which is something we always need to keep our eye on, but basically in terms of ecosystem services, fourth, growth and yield, biodiversity, cultural and spiritual recreation values, those are all quite important, but carbon sequestration as well in terms of what sort of carbon uptake is taking place at high latitudes, and whether in fact there's any sort of strengthening or weakening of the uptake of CO2 as a result of biospheric processes. Okay, so you can advance. So just real quick, I wanted to go through some papers, including this one that I led some 13 years ago, looking at 22 years of coarser resolution satellite data at the time. And if you advance the animation, basically what we showed in this paper is that for tundra areas, we primarily see, well, most places you don't see any real significant systematic deterministic trend in productivity as indicated by the vegetation indices. So in tundra, that's 62%. In boreal areas, that was like 74%. But what we did see is this much higher greening in the tundra parts of the Arctic, and somewhat surprisingly, more browning in boreal parts of the domain, which was somewhat inconsistent with some early work and also a lot of what the models were predicting. So if we can advance, and a paper came out about the same time led by Angert, also in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing that these similar results actually, but using models driven with the same satellite data really, but driving a model and showing seasonal CO2 uptake was altered by the timing of and the extent of spring warming, and drier summers tended to cancel out those increasing trends tended to be canceled out by drier conditions. Okay, next. And we see this also in extensive inventory data. This is a paper led by Girard, Ted is on it, and others here, showing that in fact, there's no strong evidence for systematic growth stimulation across these Canadian permanent sample plots, forest inventory plots, even despite warming and CO2 fertilization over the past 50 years or so. So there's pretty strong field evidence for the fact that not everywhere is greening in the boreal as well. Next slide. And then one last paper from my group. This was led by my postdoc at the time, Peter Beck. Next, advance the animation. And basically what we did in this paper was compare the trends in the satellite record to tree ring measurements. And that's what the box is showing. This is the only slide I'll show, but basically what we see there is that the tree ring data corroborate what we're capturing in these coarser resolution satellite data sets. So the lower left box there where all the red symbols are, they show where we see systematic significant trends in declining productivity from both the tree ring record and the satellite record. And you don't see a whole lot of sample points in the other parts of the boxes. In other words, the upper left or the lower right, there are a few samples in there, mostly not significant in terms of differences between the field measurements and the satellite data. So I thought this was a kind of a nice study. And also this shows, the symbols show the different species, whether it's white or black spruce, and the open circles indicate areas that had burned anytime since 1950. Next. And then also a fairly early paper on this came out by Zhang and John Kimball, based on driving models, as Anger did, using the coarser resolution satellite data records, and looking at not just systematic trends through time, but interannual variability. And what they show pretty clearly in these results is that declining productivity trends are seem to be primarily driven by higher vapor pressure deficits. So in other words, that much drier air masses and hotter temperatures, declining productivity. So that's what's shown in the red circles on these on these graphics. Next. Okay, and then recently, Ju and Masick put out a paper using the Landsat record now. So we're moving to finer resolution data sets and looking at the spatial patterns of greening and browning across, in this case, Canada and Alaska. And so this was really an advance in terms of being able to mine the Landsat record and calibrate between sensors and all that, which is challenging. And you see very different density of the historical record of imagery for Alaska versus Canada, interestingly. So this is for the period 1984 to 2012. And an important finding that they call out is that many areas where we see declining productivity trends are related to fire disturbance. And generally these areas agree with the coarser resolution satellite record, but not everywhere. The patterns are different in some places. So I think it's moving to finer resolution satellite imagery is definitely going to help us resolve what's happening in the drivers. Next. And again, these are some images captured from the paper showing some greening and browning areas and how they look in the original imagery in the left column. In the middle column is the trends from the Landsat record, and the right column is trends from the coarser resolution AVHRR GIMS 3G record. So you get some sense that they tend to agree, not everywhere, but generally. But you also get some appreciation for just how different the landscape looks when we move to finer resolution. Next. And then in terms of some of the above work that's starting to come out, this is a paper by Damien Suleimanashi and Curtis Woodcock and Mark Friedel from Boston University. This is in the ABoVE Focus collection of environmental research letters, where they show this really nice graphic based on sampling Landsat data across Canada over 30 years, where the changes are occurring and where the shifts are occurring. And you see that primarily where it's browning, the brown arrows, those are areas right at the sort of ecotone margin between woodland, shrubland biomes and the boreal forest biome. As opposed to, say, some other areas of the boreal forest where you're mostly seeing greening trends. So this is consistent with some of the earlier work that suggested trends towards a biome shift as we see much warmer, drier conditions, especially at the ecotones, driving productivity declines in those regions. Next. And then mostly we're, of course, focused here on Arctic and Boreal systems, high latitude systems. But this is something that is being monitored, captured, quantified really across the globe with the real significant implications in terms of drought-induced productivity declines and even tree mortality. Next. Okay, and then just a couple papers, quick overviews of a couple papers, fairly recent ones. one led by Berichevich, if that's pronounced correctly, basically shown for these, for the whole northern hemisphere domain, the summer temperatures, so the upper left figure is June, July, August temperature. The next one to the right is precip. And then the lower left is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And the lower right is a soil moisture index derived from microwave data. And what you see again are these areas where actually Brendan, I think, I got this slide from Brendan. He circled the sort of the above domain, Alaska, Western Canada, and you can see in those areas, again, this where we see browning trends are often typically associated with these, drier soil moisture conditions and this drought severity index and lower precipitation. So we're seeing some temperature response for sure, especially in the areas that are trending positively, but we see real water and soil moisture controls in areas that are declining in productivity. So additional evidence along those lines. Next. And then this is a paper that is quite interesting, led by Wolfgang Berman and colleagues, came out in Nature just like a week or two ago, where they are looking at the effect of warmer springs on not just the spring productivity, but the full growing season productivity across the whole Northern Hemisphere, and looking at these lagged productivity responses. So the top map is derived from satellite observations. The lower map is derived from a model informed with satellite data. And what you see, and then the green areas are where we're seeing so-called positive lag effects, meaning if you have an earlier growing season and a warmer spring, you're seeing increasing productivity throughout the growing season primarily. And then in the red areas, you're seeing even if you have earlier growing season and warmer springs, you're seeing declines later in the season that completely offset those productivity increases earlier in the season. So the satellite data are capturing this, as you can see in the upper map, but the models are still frequently missing these drought and vapor pressure deficit induced responses. So that's further indication that we need to really improve the type of modeling across the domain, and that's a big focus of the ABoVE effort as well. Next. Okay, and then I think maybe this is the last slide, I'm not sure. So this is a nice review paper that came out by Marten and Girard also in the last couple of weeks. It's a review in environmental research letters. And basically what they did is looked at, it's a nice review, I encourage you to have a look at it. But they also went through and had this table in there about multi-scale factors that we could focus on that would help us get a better handle on documenting, capturing the drivers and trends. So I'll leave that at that. Next slide, if there is one. Okay, yeah, and then this is just my summary slide, similar to what Howie did. I won't read through it, but this is sort of my assessment of some of the things we need to consider when we're looking at the satellite record relative to field measurements, the fact of different vegetation types. Fire disturbance is a big one. We'll hear about that in a minute from Erik. Different types of field measurements that can actually capture those drought effects. Tree mortality observations we're showing with a recent paper that Brendan did and additional work coming out that you can actually get these precursors of mortality from the satellite time series records. But we're also now moving to much higher resolution data, Landsat, and even finer, that, especially in the Google Earth Engine environment, will really help us resolve what's happening. And so there are a number of ABoVE projects focused on this, and we'll see a number of papers coming out in the near future. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you. If there's time for questions, I can take one or two.
I think we're going to have to move on here because we're running late here. So I'll go on with my presentation here. If I can find it.
So,
there we go.
yeah,
So can you see my screen?
not yet, Erik.
All right, just a second here. Got to get back.
While Eric's figuring that out, I saw some people asking about if they could get the presentations, and I think they can be downloaded from the website.
So
Yes.
can you see it? Can you see it now?
Yes, we can. Can you go to slideshow mode? Yep, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Erik.
So the third effort that we're working on in this as part of this activity is a little bit different than the ones that Scott and Howie are leading, because I think in the previous two efforts there's been a long-term ongoing efforts on research in this area, whereas I think in general people realize that these major disturbances like fire and insects lead to a decrease in NDVI or browning, and then there's a gradual recovery or greening post-fire. So that's a pretty well-known observation. And what we would like to do in this effort is actually exploit the data set that's being produced as part of ABoVE by Curtis Woodcock and his colleagues at Boston University, that has produced a time series Landsat data from 1985 to 2015, and use these data to see if we can better understand the spatial patterns of different vegetation recovery trajectories that are occurring in these disturbed areas that you really don't have the resolution to do these types of studies with either the AVHRR or even the MODIS data set. Even though that MODIS data are 250 meters, the spatial scale of some of these disturbance and recovery patterns are such that you really can't tease apart these different recovery trajectories. And so the goal of this effort is to actually examine if the spectral signatures from the time series Landsat data, how can we use these to look at these different patterns of post-disturbance vegetation recovery in both North American boreal forest and tundra. And my thoughts is that we'll actually look at three focus areas here. The first being post-fire vegetation recovery in boreal forests. The second being post-insect vegetation recovery in forest. And then the third one is going to look at post-fire vegetation recovery in tundra. And so the way that this study is designed, there's actually going to be some crossover between the activities that Scott and Howie are leading. So we're going to have discussions with those other groups to identify where we have areas of commonality between the three activities. What I'm hoping is that I can attract some other people who are interested in this topic to lead two out of the three areas. I plan to lead the post-fire regeneration study, but we're looking for somebody to help lead the post-insect disturbance vegetation recovery and then the post-fire vegetation recovery. I've had some discussions with people on both of these topics, but this is something that needs to be fleshed out. I think the proposed approach is going to be pretty typical in each area, meaning the researchers participating identify the different patterns of vegetation recovery that have been observed following disturbances. And then the group will identify study sites that can be used to examine the time series Landsat data for these various recovery patterns. I've talked to Curtis Woodcock. He's willing, if we can produce lat longe for different study sites, to do extraction of the Landsat data sets for us and then work with us for evaluating the time series data for differentiating between different recovery patterns. Because even though NDVI is a common metric that's used, there's other metrics that are based upon ratios of the shortwave and near infrared that could also be used to examine post-vegetation recovery. Just an example here, this is a study site where there's been a lot of research on post-fire recovery in three different burned areas in Alaska. This is actually a site where we've collected airborne data during the ABoVE airborne campaign. So there's a lot of ongoing research in this area. This area also includes a tower for a neon tower. So it's a high interest area. The Bonanza Creek LTER has study sites in this area as well. What we're seeing here is based upon fire severity. There's actually two distinct post-fire recovery trajectories in areas that were occupied by black spruce prior to the fire. In one trajectory, you're seeing after light burns, it regenerating into spruce. And in other areas, you're actually seeing an aspen replacing the spruce. This actually illustrates the subpixel mixing problem we have. This is an area in the 1987 burn where, let's see here, you can actually see the deciduous recovery throughout this area of the trees that are coming in severely burned area, but these areas without deciduous cover are actually black spruce. And so trying to look at post-fire recovery, even using MODIS data, you'll see in this area, there's just a lot of mixed pixels going on between deciduous and coniferous recovery. And so what we're hoping is that the Landsat time series is going to provide us with enough resolution to be able to discriminate between these two different areas. And then there's been research that's ongoing here that shows that what tends to happen is that the rates of recovery, at least as measured by NDVI, has a faster regeneration recovery than in the spruce regeneration. So hopefully we can develop approaches to use the time series data to examine different recovery patterns. And so there's a number of different forest types across North America. As you go eastward out of Alaska, you start getting pine species rather than coniferous species. And then there's actually areas that we've noticed that you're actually not getting any tree generation at all. You're going to a shrub cover post-fire. So there's a lot of different, I think, things to look at within this whole area of research that we can start looking at how to exploit these time series data sets. And also, I should mention here, I know that there's some other Landsat data sets that Scott's group's been working on here too. So we don't just necessarily have, and some data products that are being developed. So we could be looking at different data products as well as just the straightforward Landsat data set itself. And as Scott mentioned too, it's not only using the field data where plot data have been collected, but we have these high resolution digital globe data sets that could be quite valuable in terms of interpreting what we're seeing on the Landsat data. So there's a lot of opportunities here. I think here's the next step, and I think Howie and Scott, I'm going to speak for both of you here, because I think if you're interested in any one of these three areas, you should contact Scott or Howie or myself to let you know their interest. I want to identify leads for each of the three focus areas. Working with the groups, I think we need to identify location of possible study sites, which have field data for each one of them, primarily focusing on areas disturbed from the 1970s through the late 2000s. And then we should next work on convening webinars to develop study plans for the three focus areas, and that include discussions of crossover with the other greening browning groups. And so that ends my talk, and I'll hand it back to Sarah.
So Eric, there's five minutes left until the top of the hour, and I suppose you want to open it up for questions and discussion now.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions or comments on either of the three efforts that we're focused on here? And don't be shy.
This is Scott. I'll just say real quick while people are thinking of questions that there will be a National Academy workshop on greening and browning. Hopefully many of you got that email. April Melvin is heading that up and I'm chairing it, and April's on the call. I think you could probably contact her if you'd like to attend.
Scott, what is that?
It's a National Academy workshop on greening and browning.
But when?
Oh, when? It's the 6th and 7th of December, just before AGU.
And it's going to be in Washington, D.C., right?
Right.
Okay.
And April, will there be a registration email coming out?
Where you can RSVP to attend. And it is open for anyone to attend. I mean, we're reaching out to specific individuals for speaking roles, but it is open to the public, and we'll also have breakout sessions where everyone that attends the meeting will get to participate in that way.
So we don't have to register?
You will get an email about registering for it closer to the date.
Okay, thanks.
April, is that focused on high latitudes, or is that a general greening and browning?
It's focused on high latitude, so it'll cover both tundra and boreal forest.
Okay, thanks.
Just to remind people who are interested in pursuing this that we have a lot of, at the ABoVE project office, we have a lot of information about where historically people are working and where folks are currently working, as well as a lot of info on where the ABoVE airborne flights have occurred and are likely to repeat. So contact Liz and me for assistance with some of that.
Yeah, this is Liz. I'll just echo what Peter said, and I'd be interested in helping out with some of these efforts too. And so I'll email you separately, Eric. But I know where a lot of these data sets are, so I'm happy to help people get to them as well.
Hey, Liz, that sounds like it would be a great thing to post on the website. You can do it as a comment, or you can just add an update to the website so people know how to get a hold of you to get those data sets if they're interested.
Sure, I'll post it would be a comment to this meeting. Yeah, and I can put links to where to get those data. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I've got a question for Scott, or for everyone really, who might know about this. I'm wondering the differences that was seen in the Dew and Masek study between the Landsat record and the GIMS. I'm wondering if that's because of artifacts in the GIMS record. Scott, do you know anything about that?
Well, there was a paper that came out. I almost shared a slide from, led by Kevin Day, who was working with me, where we compared a bunch of different satellite data sets and showed really that they don't agree as well as we would like in the time periods where they overlap. So that came out in Global Change Biology, led by Kevin Guay, for those who are interested, but we did not look at Landsat at the time. Yeah, all of these satellite records have a whole series of considerations in terms of making sure that they're consistent from sensor to sensor, platform to platform through time. So it's a challenge.
And to complicate or to enhance the challenge, let's put it that way. I don't think that the details have really been released yet, but NASA is in the process of having a data buy from Planet. And a lot of you university folks can get Planet data for free in specific areas. And there has been some work on doing NDVI, sort of site calibrated NDVI using the Planet data, which is sort of in between resolution between Landsat and Digital Globe in terms of spatial resolution, but can have a much higher temporal resolution if there's interest in that, maybe during growing seasons, for instance, than either Landsat or Digital Globe. You know, in the I know it's a roll of the dice, but in the cases where sufficiently cloud-free observations can be made, you could have easily have daily observations with Planet, as opposed to much less frequently from Digital Globe. And of course, you know what the Landsat revisit rate is.
All right, this is Erik. It looks like we've run out the clock here, but I'd like to thank everybody for participating and encourage you to contact us if you're interested in participating in any of these activities that have been discussed today.